Yeah, we just always had this issue of like, especially as history teachers, like it shouldn't be a political act to talk about the history of slavery or the Black experience, right?
Well, and that's the thing, that the fact that it has become political to try to study the history is saddening to me.
And
well,
then
Emmett Till to me is the backstory is that he was a 14-year-old kid from Chicago in 1955, I believe. He had come down to visit his cousins in Mississippi, a town called Money, Mississippi. He was a Black kid, and he was visiting his cousins. His grandfather was a sharecropper, so they were really poor. And one day he and his cousin walked into town to like the general store. And the general store is owned by a husband and wife, Carolyn and Roy Bryant. And they walked into the general store, bought whatever, didn't buy whatever. But as they walked out, Emmett said something to Carolyn, or there was some sort of interaction. And he was a 14-year-old kid. And as you and I know, 14-year-old kids are a whole other breed of animal. They're just cocky. 14-year-old boys are just cocky and kind of trying to figure out who they are.
Yeah.
So there was some interaction between Emmett and Carolyn, who was a white woman, that she took offense to. And it was either as big as he said something to the effect, and I don't know what it was, but some reports said that he said, "Don't be scared, baby. I've been with white girls before," which sounds like such a 14-year-old boy.
It does.
thing.
I was gonna say, I was like, man, out of this like super tense context, I'm like,
Yeah.
Oh, I've had 14-year-old boys say insane things in my presence, either to me or in my presence, where I'm like, wow, I don't understand why you would think that was okay. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But they're 14. They think everything's okay. The more inappropriate, the better. But it could have been as egregious as that, or he could have smiled at her, whistled at her, winked at her. I don't know that we really know. But
we'll never know, right? I mean, we're never going to know what that interaction was really like. And I think one of the things, just before you even keep going, is like, even the most egregious version of that narrative is like, okay, that interaction should have then just ended there. And it could have easily just ended there. Yeah.
It could have. But she took offense, and she told her husband. And that night, first of all, Emmett's cousin, who was with him, who is from the South, was like, we got to get out of here. We got to get out of here. And so they went home. And that night, about 2 a.m, they were at their granddad's house, and somebody knocked on their door. And allegedly, from everything I know, there were 2 men, and they asked the grandfather, they said, "Where's the boy that talked to the woman today?" And the cousin was like, don't go out there. And Emmett went out there, and they grabbed him and they took him in the truck. And apparently there was somebody sitting in the truck, which we think might have been Carolyn Bryant.
The woman?
Sorry?
The woman?
Yes, the woman.
Oh, interesting.
So Emmett went with these 2 men, and he was never seen alive again. His body was found, I think, a couple of days later. He had been beaten. He had been killed. His body had been dumped in the river, the Tallahatchie River in Mississippi. He had a cotton gin fan, like this giant 50-pound cotton gin fan that had been tied around his neck to weight the body down. And when his body was discovered, his mother came down from Chicago to claim the body, and the body went back to Chicago, and she had an open casket funeral.
Yeah.
And he, the mortician undertaker said, "Do you want me to touch up his body, his face?" And she said, "No, you can't fix that." And at his funeral in Chicago, it was open casket, and there were photographers there from, I believe, Jet magazine. And they took photos of his face and his body in the casket, and it doesn't look like a human face. It looks like Play-Doh, because the bones in his face had been broken and smashed, and it just doesn't look recognizable immediately. And when those photos were published, it to me it sort of is. I always start with kind of the modern civil rights movement with the murder of Emmett Till, because when those photos were published, it's like people around the country and around the world really saw what it meant to be Black in the South. And to add further issue to it, the two men were arrested. They were charged with his murder. At the trial, which was held in a nearby town, all the jurors were white males. The defense attorney, and during the trial, Mose Wright, who was Emmett's grandfather, this sharecropper, this poor Black man who was maybe one or two generations out of slavery, he stood up and testified against the men.
Whoa.
And the prosecutor was like, do you recognize the men who came to your house that night? And there's a famous picture of him standing in the courthouse pointing. And to be a Black man in Mississippi calling out two white men who were of some level of power, he was taking his own life in his hands at that point.
Yeah.
The jury deliberated for maybe 45 minutes. They came back, they found the guys not guilty right across the board, despite all the evidence, despite the testimony. And those two men got off, and a couple of months later, they gave an interview to a journalist from Look magazine. And basically, they told the entire story of what happened and confessed to everything. And because of double jeopardy, they could never be tried again.
Wow.
They basically said that they hadn't planned on killing Emmett, but he'd been uppity when they were talking to him. They just wanted
kidnapped.
To talk. Yeah. And they wanted to make sure he knew how you don't behave in the South if you're Black. And
so there's a few before. Okay, I have a lot of thoughts.
Yeah.
I have one thing I didn't know that I don't know how I didn't know this, but I didn't know that it was very clear who did it and that they went to trial. For some reason in my version of the story that I'd always heard, it was like, we're all pretty sure we know who it was, but I didn't realize it was that overt. Like, nope, they went to trial. All the people around Emmett Till's family said no, it was these two people. That's insane.
One thing about that, by the way,
yeah.
At the trial, when the defense attorney was doing his summation, he looked at the all-white male jury and he said, I know that every last Anglo-Saxon one of you will come to the right decision. Basically saying, you're white and you're in Mississippi and you're not going to find another white man guilty for killing a Black person in Mississippi. So pulled out race at that point. Like it's not that long ago.
Yeah, and like I feel like no one ever has good intentions who refers to white people as Anglo-Saxons. I'm just gonna say that's like a random part, but it's like I've never heard anyone refer to someone as Anglo-Saxon and not be like, I think you're part of the Klan. But that's and I imagine the prosecutor, right, is probably a state or like is just an assigned, like, you know, their family's not paying for a lawyer, like and that's so these are a few things that like tying in some other aspects of history to this story. One is like the Great Migration is something I think about a lot when I think about Emmett Till, right? Because the Great Migration is this moment in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s when a lot of African Americans leave the South. They go get in factory jobs, especially during World War I. They end up in Chicago, Harlem, Detroit. And so to me, it's so interesting because Emmett is of that first generation that had this different, obviously there had been free African Americans in the North before, but he's really of that first generation. It's almost like a case study of you take the same family and then you separate kids and one kid stays in the South and one kid grows up in the North. And not that the North was a great place still to be Black when you were Black either, but I think that just really shows even within one generation how much different it was that he just didn't seem to understand the severity of what it was like.
Right. He didn't know how to behave as a Black kid, how to behave as a Black kid in the South in the 1950s, and just was a kid and got killed for it. Yeah. And so that's the idea that again, his cousin is like, you don't talk to white women, you don't do that, you don't say that, you don't act that way. That his cousin grew up understanding that, and who was the same age, who was 14 years old and already knew that somehow he was perceived as lesser than.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you'd had
And
that conversation, right? I mean, you hear black families talking all the time about the talk when they have to have the talk, especially with their sons, about like,
Right.
hey, look, like these are some things you just can't do out in public. These are if you get pulled over by the police, here's how you're supposed to act. And it's like, yeah, that's one of the things. Okay, to lighten the mood a tiny bit, I'm going to make a comparison to the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which is that there was that episode of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air where Carlton and Will are driving their dad's friend's really expensive car, and they get pulled over, and then they have this whole debate about why they got pulled over, right? And it's like Carlton, who's grown up in Bel-Air, is like, no, they just thought we were lost. And Will's like, no, I know exactly why we got pulled over, right? It's sort of, it's that distinction. But yeah, I just think, yeah, this conversation too about, like, one of the reasons too why I'm glad that we're still talking about Emmett Till is, for example, even like John Lewis, who we're going to talk about later or next, is that, like, you know, he has described multiple times, he said, like, Emmett Till was my George Floyd, right? Like, so for the things that are going on right now, like, Emmett Till, like, you didn't have social media, you didn't have Facebook video where you could see a black man being brutalized. But so it's also, like, I think the Emmett Till story is just as much to the Mamie Till story, right, of Emmett's mom.
Yes.
Because, like, Emmett Till was unfortunately not the only person that happened to, but it's, like, his mother having the strength to say, like, no, I want everyone to see exactly what happened to my son, is that on its own is, like, a civil rights act, you know?
And those photographs were the George Floyd video of the day, because I think what we saw after George Floyd and what we saw with the momentum in the Black Lives Matter rallies over the last couple of months is white people getting involved and people of other races. It moved out of being Black Lives Matter moved out of being a black movement to a civil rights movement to there are a lot of people of a lot of different races, ethnicities, religions, genders who are standing up for this Black Lives Matter moment, because it's not just about Black lives, and even if it were, that's enough.
Yeah.
That everybody saw how George Floyd died, and everybody saw the injustice of it. And I think the same thing happened with Emmett Till, that when his mom, Mamie Till, had the open casket and she invited in photographers, people around the country were like, oh my gosh, I mean, I've heard about the South, but now I'm seeing it. And I've heard what it's like to be black in the South, but now I see this kid. I mean,
and it's a 14-year-old boy. That's the thing too. And it's sad to say, but it's like, first of all, I mean, most of white society in the South sees 14-year-old boys as full-grown adults that are to be feared, which is insane. But the other question I'm curious about, just as like almost a thought experiment, because if 1955 is when the Montgomery bus boycott is going on, right? Like that's when Rosa Parks refuses to move and Dr. King is rising and becoming sort of the voice of the movement. And I think we like to tell the story that that's what sparked the modern... Right. I think we like to tell the narrative where we talk about Rosa Parks and we talk about Dr. King because those are less sad. You know, it's like, oh, a nice, let's be honest, lighter-skinned woman who worked for her church, and she just refused to move, and no one then brutally murdered her. And I wonder, though, to what extent in the 1950s was Emmett Till way more of a catalyst for white people than Montgomery?
And that's why I always kind of start this unit with Emmett Till, that I didn't grow up. I mean, I've grown up in Texas, and I don't remember learning about Emmett Till in high school. And I don't know if that's a Southern thing. I don't know if it's just, you know, a time of when I was in high school. But it's important to me to teach Emmett Till, and it's important to me to make sure my students understand that the civil rights movement has this long and in-depth history. But when we're talking about the modern civil rights movement, it doesn't start with Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. It goes back a little bit before, and I really think that the injustice of Emmett Till's murder helped open the doors, so that there was mobilization. The NAACP was doing things in the South, and they were organizing and they were starting the movement. But the acceptance, I think, and the understanding of really what the modern civil rights movement is about you saw it in those pictures of Emmett Till.
Yeah.
That it's not just about one thing. It's about the entirety of what it means to be Black in the South, and now it's what it means to be Black in America. There is a whole separate set of conditions and circumstances and rules that are unwritten but understood that are dividing us.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's important for everybody. There's a great documentary on it called The Murder of Emmett Till. There's a book called The Blood of Emmett Till. It's important for people to understand what happened and who he was to really understand the context of today.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, well, I'm pretty sure I learned about it in high school because I had you for U.S. history. So, so I'm pretty sure I learned about. I was trying to think of like when I first learned. I was like, it was probably in Kathy's class. So
probably in AP U.S. history.
Yeah. So thank you. John Lewis is like the guy that gives no one an excuse. So it's like, I'm too young. Well, he was 15 when he wrote a letter to Dr. King and got college advice. And then people are like, I'm too old. And it's like, well, I mean, how old was he when he just passed away? I guess I should look up
I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and I'm still going to get out there and march and push. And
no excuses.